Power seems obvious. Laws, police, armies, commands. Yet power does not live in orders themselves, but in the willingness of people to obey them. History shows many cases where strong armies and wealthy states collapsed not because of external enemies, but due to an internal refusal to recognize authority as legitimate. When people stop believing in the right of power to rule, laws become paper, institutions turn into scenery, and fear remains the only tool of control. We rarely ask why we obey authority, yet the answer explains why some states remain stable for decades, while others collapse suddenly within months. Power, legitimacy, and state systems are not abstract ideas. They are everyday mechanisms that shape social reality, even when people fail to notice them. To understand how states function, we must stop focusing on force alone and begin examining recognition, trust, and voluntary public consent. What is power? Power is not a title or formal position. Power is the ability to make others act against their initial interests, preferences, or personal intentions. Sometimes this happens through direct force, sometimes through resources and money, and sometimes through norms, habits, and shared expectations. The most effective form of power is invisible. It does not issue commands openly, but quietly shapes what society considers normal and acceptable behavior. People obey not only out of fear of punishment, but also because of social expectations, internal beliefs, and fear of exclusion from the system. For this reason, power never relies on a single source. It consistently combines coercion, resources, information control, and social norms. Power is not a single act of violence, but a stable system of influence that shapes collective behavior and patterns of obedience over time. Not all influence is power, and not all governance requires force. These concepts are often confused, although in practice they operate by different rules. Influence persuades and shapes opinions, governance organizes processes, while power compels obedience, even when resistance appears reasonable. When governance loses effectiveness and influence weakens, power becomes the final instrument used to preserve order and authority. States often present power as governance in order to reduce resistance and create the appearance of voluntary participation by society. The more effectively governance functions, the less visible raw power becomes, allowing authority to operate without constant coercion. Strong systems govern in ways that make power almost invisible. Weak systems are forced to constantly remind society of authority and control. Legitimacy. Legitimacy is the stable belief that authority has the right to rule society, even when its decisions are unpopular or cause dissatisfaction. Without legitimacy, power gradually turns into coercion, and the state becomes an apparatus of force lacking moral or social justification. People are willing to tolerate mistakes, crises, and even injustice as long as they believe the system itself remains lawful and fair. Legitimacy is not popularity. It is a deeper belief rooted in shared ideas of justice, order, and the rightful use of authority. Once legitimacy is lost, elections, slogans, or public statements are unable to restore trust quickly or reverse the erosion of authority. Legitimacy is the most valuable asset of power and at the same time the most fragile resource, difficult to restore once lost. Sources of legitimacy. Authority may be recognized as legitimate for different reasons, and each historical period develops its own foundations of political legitimacy. Tradition, law, charisma, and effectiveness represent the main sources of legitimacy, yet none of them remain stable forever. When traditional foundations weaken, power faces a crisis of recognition, even if it formally retains legal authority and institutions. Modern states often combine multiple sources of legitimacy in order to compensate for weaknesses and maintain overall system stability. Excessive reliance on a single source of legitimacy makes political systems highly vulnerable to social change and trust crises. Legitimacy is not a fixed condition, but a delicate balance that requires constant reinforcement and adaptation to social change. The state as a tool. The state often appears natural and inevitable, yet it is in fact a deliberately constructed system created to organize behavior, regulate power, and maintain control. The state is composed of laws, institutions, bureaucratic structures, and systems of control, not of identity, culture, or shared collective memory over time. The same state apparatus can either safeguard society or repress it, depending on who commands it, whose interests it serves, and goals it pursues. People and nations may survive for centuries without a state, yet no state can endure without an organized, governed, compliant, stable society. For this reason, the state always reflects internal power balances rather than abstract moral ideals or theoretical principles. The state represents a form through which power is exercised, but it cannot serve as a moral justification for authority by itself. Types of state systems. Different state systems organize power through varied institutions and rules, yet each ultimately seeks the same end: preserving authority, stability, and control. Democratic, authoritarian, and hybrid regimes govern society through different blends of legitimacy, consent, control, and coercive enforcement mechanisms. There is no universal model of state organization. However, recurring structures of power and control emerge repeatedly across societies and historical eras. Each political system adapts to specific cultural, economic, and historical conditions that shape shared public expectations. Serious problems emerge when existing power structures fail to adapt to real social conditions, expectations, and demands of society today. System stability depends not on formal labels, but on how well structures align with the expectations and beliefs of the governed. Democracy and legitimacy. Democracy is often reduced to elections, yet elections are only one limited mechanism through which legitimacy is built, maintained, and tested through ongoing participation and trust. A functioning democracy requires more than periodic elections. It relies on ongoing civic participation, feedback mechanisms, active dialogue, and sustained public trust in institutions. When elections become an empty ritual without real influence, democracy exists mainly in appearance, keeping institutions and procedures intact, while real power moves elsewhere and citizens feel participation without impact. Democratic systems are especially sensitive to legitimacy crises because their authority rests on public consent and shared trust. So when belief in institutions erodes, the foundations of power weaken fast. For this reason, declining trust in democratic systems is often followed by sudden political realignments, institutional paralysis, and rising social radicalization that reshapes public debate today. Democracy ultimately exists not in ballots or procedures, but in the depth of trust, reciprocity, and credibility that connect citizens with institutions over time, shaping legitimacy and stability. Authoritarian systems. Authoritarian regimes often present an image of stability, order, and firm control, yet this strength frequently masks fragile institutions and systemic weaknesses within the system itself. Authoritarian regimes seek to offset fragile or declining legitimacy by expanding surveillance, intensifying repression, and maintaining constant psychological and institutional pressure across society. The greater the fear of losing recognition, the harsher and more intrusive control becomes, as authorities depend on surveillance, pressure, and coercive measures to maintain conformity and public obedience. Repression can temporarily silence dissent and conceal the outward signs of political crisis, yet it only delays confrontation, leaving deeper sources of legitimacy erosion unresolved and intensifying underneath.
Исторический опыт показывает, что подобные системы могут казаться устойчивыми и контролируемыми. Однако в реальности они рушатся внезапно, когда скрытые противоречия достигают критической точки для общества в целом.
Historical experience demonstrates that such systems, though appearing stable and well-controlled for long periods, often disintegrate suddenly and without warning when internal weaknesses accumulate quietly. Legitimacy crisis. A legitimacy crisis takes shape quietly, long before mass protests or revolutions appear, slowly reshaping public trust and altering how societies interpret authority and institutions. Legitimacy crises increasingly reveal themselves through widespread cynicism, civic disengagement, and an open erosion of trust, where institutions are mocked, rules are ignored, and authority loses its weight. At this stage, the state continues to exist in a formal legal sense, maintaining institutions and procedures, yet it increasingly fails to carry out its core social roles and responsibilities towards society. When laws are followed mainly out of fear instead of shared belief, obedience becomes mechanical and hollow, slowly corroding trust, legitimacy, and internal cohesion until the entire system weakens from the inside. Restoring lost legitimacy is almost always a slower, more complex, and more uncertain process than the quiet, gradual erosion of trust that occurs during extended periods of political decline and institutional weakening cycles. The collapse of public trust is often the earliest and most reliable signal that a society is entering a phase of deep structural change, where existing institutions lose legitimacy and long-standing rules no longer command confidence. The future of states. Modern states increasingly face complex legitimacy challenges as rapid technological change and deep social transformation reshape authority, expectations, participation, and public trust. Technology and globalization reshape power by accelerating information flows, weakening traditional borders, redistributing influence among actors, and forcing states to adapt how authority is exercised today. People increasingly demand transparency and participation in decision-making, yet many are not fully prepared to accept shared responsibility for complex collective outcomes and the long-term consequences they produce. Under accelerating change, states are increasingly compelled to respond to shifting social expectations and public demands, or else face a slow erosion of institutional authority, governance capacity, and trust over time. Future political systems will depend not only on technical efficiency and institutional speed, but on their sustained capacity to generate legitimacy, social consent, transparency, accountability, and public trust. In the 21st century, legitimacy increasingly becomes the decisive strategic resource shaping authority and trust, determining whether political systems endure, adapt, or slowly lose their capacity to govern. Power may appear permanent and unshakable, but its survival is never guaranteed. It exists only while people collectively recognize it as legitimate and continue willingly or silently to grant their consent to its authority. It does not depend solely on written laws or military force. It survives because ordinary people, day after day, recognize authority, internalize its rules, and willingly treat that power as rightful and normal. When this recognition erodes, the most powerful political systems start to weaken, lose authority, and eventually collapse, as institutions fail to command belief, obedience, and acceptance from society. The history of states is, at its core, the long story of trust built between authority and society, and of the slow, often invisible processes through which that trust weakens, fragments, and erodes over time. Understanding how power and legitimacy function equips societies to recognize hidden influence, question authority, resist manipulation, and reduce risks of institutional failure and systemic crises over time now. Power operates as an evolving social contract, sustained by shared recognition and trust, whose rules can be renegotiated whenever legitimacy erodes and society withdraws its consent from those in power.
Hello everyone. I am very excited to share my new YouTube video with you, and I need your support to continue to bring quality and enriching content. If you enjoyed my content, please help me by like the video, it helps me reach more people and spread the message. Subscribe to the channel using the subscribe button below so you don't miss any new update or video. Press the bell to receive notifications every time I upload new content. And if you would like to support me directly and help me create more content, you are welcome to join me on Patreon. Your support is significant for me and allows me to continue investing in creating quality and enjoyable content for you. Thank you so much for joining and watching. I appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. See you in the next video.